You're behind an MG42. You've just fired 12,000 rounds into the waves of Allied soldiers coming at you. For 9 hours straight, your hands are blistered from changing hot barrels. Your ears are ringing from the noise. Your position is collapsing. Your comrades are dead. And now, American soldiers are at the bunker entrance. You raise your hands. You surrender. What happens next isn't what you'd expect. And for many gunners on D-Day, surrender wasn't the end of the nightmare. It was just the beginning of a different one. June 6, 1944. The biggest amphibious invasion in human history. Over 150,000 Allied troops hitting 5 beaches along the Normandy coast. And waiting for them in reinforced concrete bunkers, German machine gun crews. The MG42, Hitler's buzzsaw, capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute. That's 20 bullets every second. The sound alone could freeze soldiers where they stood. That distinctive ripping, tearing noise that veterans said sounded like canvas being torn or a chainsaw cutting through wood. But this isn't a story about the weapon. This is about the men behind it, what they faced, what they did, and what happened when the beach was finally taken and the bunkers were overrun, because the aftermath rarely gets told. The German defensive strategy for the Atlantic Wall was simple in theory. Stop the invasion before it leaves the water. Don't let them reach the beach. Don't let them establish a foothold. Kill them in the surf where they're most vulnerable. To do this, German engineers built fortified positions all along the coast, Widerstandsnester, resistance nests. These weren't just random bunkers. They were carefully positioned so each one could cover the others with overlapping fields of fire. Cannons, mortars, and machine guns all coordinated to create killing zones with no safe approaches. On Omaha Beach alone, there were 15 of these strongpoints. Many were set to fire down the length of the shoreline. Enfilade fire, they called it, which meant if you escaped one gun's line of fire, you'd run straight into another's. There was no safe route. Every yard of sand was covered by at least 2, sometimes 3 different firing positions. A standard MG42 crew consisted of 3 men: the gunner who fired the weapon, an assistant gunner who fed ammunition belts and swapped barrels when they overheated, which happened often, and a third man carrying extra ammunition. In 1944, many of these crews had combat experience from earlier campaigns, North Africa, the Eastern Front, Italy. They knew how to use the weapon. They knew its capabilities and limitations. But by D-Day, the German army was also filling positions with younger replacements. Teenagers, some of them, who'd never been in real combat, who'd trained on the weapon but never fired it at actual human beings rushing toward them across open ground. But no matter their background, though, their orders were clear. Hold your position. Keep firing until the beach is clear or until you're dead. Those were the only acceptable outcomes. What most of them didn't realize was that the same weapon that made them so effective would also make them the highest priority targets on the entire beach. Allied planners knew exactly where these positions were. Intelligence officers had been mapping the coastline for months. Aerial reconnaissance, French resistance reports, commando raids. They'd marked strongpoints by number and location, noted fields of fire, estimated crew sizes. The plan was neat on paper. Heavy naval bombardment before the landings would destroy or neutralize the fortifications. Bombers would crater the beach defenses, and the infantry would mop up whatever survived. Clean, efficient, quick. Reality was very different. The naval bombardment that morning was massive. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers opening fire before dawn. Thousands of shells pounding the beaches and bluffs. The noise was incredible. The explosions visible from miles away. But reinforced concrete is hard to destroy. Many bunkers had walls several feet thick, roofs designed to deflect artillery shells, firing ports angled to minimize exposure. Direct hits would shake the structure, crack the concrete, but rarely penetrate completely. Which meant when the first landing craft hit the beach, many of those guns were still operational. Crews inside were shaken, deafened, covered in dust, but alive and ready. When German gunners looked out their firing slits that morning and saw what was coming, hundreds of landing craft, thousands of men, the entire horizon filled with ships, many later described it as unreal, surreal, like watching something from a movie, not something actually happening. But it was happening, and their training took over. Load the belt, charge the weapon, wait for the range to close, then open fire. The first waves hit the beach at 6:30 a.m. On Omaha Beach, the plan had been for amphibious tanks, DD tanks, duplex drive, to provide covering fire and suppress the bunkers while infantry landed. Out of 32 tanks launched in the first wave, 27 sank in the rough seas. Only 5 made it to shore. Of those, 3 were still able to fight, and even they were knocked out quickly by anti-tank guns, which left the infantry completely exposed. No armor support, no suppressing fire, just men wading through chest-deep water toward a beach covered by interlocking machine gun fire. The MG42's rate of fire, 1,200 rounds per minute, created what soldiers described as a wall of bullets. You couldn't see individual shots, just a continuous stream, tracer rounds every 5th bullet lighting up the trajectory like a laser. German gunners used specific tactics to maximize casualties. One was called mowing the grass, aiming low to hit legs and knock soldiers down. Wounded men would scream, draw attention, and medics or friends would try to help, which created more targets, more casualties. Another tactic involved coordination between multiple gun positions. One gun would fire tracer rounds high, making it look like the shots were going over the soldiers' heads. Meanwhile, a hidden gun would fire at actual killing height with no tracers. Soldiers would think they were safe, stand up, keep moving, and get cut down by the gun they didn't see. Simple tactics, but effective and deadly. The beach quickly became a nightmare. Bodies in the surf, wounded men calling for help, equipment floating in the waves, burning landing craft, and over it all, that constant tearing sound of the MG42s. For the men behind the guns, the experience was different, but no less intense. 20-year-old Hinrich Severloh was manning an MG42 at Strong Point Wien 62 overlooking Omaha Beach. He woke to alarms in the darkness. The invasion had begun. By dawn, he was in his prepared position with a clear view of the water. What he saw, he later described as impossible to comprehend. Hundreds of ships, thousands of men, all heading straight toward him. When the first landing craft hit the beach, he opened fire. For the next 9 hours, he fired continuously, belt after belt of ammunition, nearly 12,000 rounds total. His assistant gunner was killed early, which meant Severloh had to work the gun alone, firing, reloading, changing barrels when they overheated. Around him, his comrades were being killed one by one. Artillery, naval gunfire, small arms fire from soldiers who'd made it close enough to shoot back. Severloh said it felt impossible. No matter how many soldiers he shot, more kept coming. The waves never stopped. And slowly, inevitably, his position was being overrun. By early afternoon, with ammunition running low and the position collapsing, he grabbed a rifle and ran. That retreat became a scramble through shell craters and hedges until nightfall. The next morning, surrounded by American troops, he surrendered, but was careful not to reveal he'd been one of the machine gunners responsible for so many deaths. Not all gunners got that chance. Many were killed in their bunkers, hit by grenades, satchel chargers, flamethrowers. Others surrendered and were taken prisoner. But the treatment of those prisoners varied significantly depending on who captured them and when. Allied soldiers were trained to follow the rules of war. The 1929 Geneva Convention required humane treatment of prisoners. Most did. Most took surrendering Germans into custody, disarmed them, sent them to the rear for processing. But there are documented accounts of captured machine gunners being shot on the spot. Not officially, not in reports, but in the chaos of close combat, in the moments right after losing friends to that same gun. Some soldiers didn't accept to surrender. It's hard to be professional towards someone who just killed your entire squad minutes before you captured them. Hard to see them as a prisoner when you're standing over the bodies of men you trained with, lived with, fought beside. These incidents were rarely documented, partly because they violated the rules of war, partly because commanders didn't want to draw attention to them, and partly because in the scale of D-Day, with thousands dead and tens of thousands wounded, a few isolated reprisals didn't seem significant compared to the overall objective. But for the gunners who surrendered, that uncertainty hung over every decision in those final minutes. Do you fight to the end and die for certain, or do you surrender and risk being shot anyway by soldiers who just lost friends to your fire? Not all German gunners were committed Nazis. Some were conscripts from occupied territories, Poland, Czechoslovakia, France, pressed into service, given a weapon and a position, told to fight. These men sometimes surrendered quickly once the situation was hopeless. Others fought on, out of fear of their own officers, or belief that surrender wouldn't save them, or simple desperation. For Allied infantry, reaching an MG42 position meant getting close, dangerously close, often within meters while under heavy fire. Every step forward was a gamble. More than a few soldiers were killed just meters from their target, seconds before they could throw the grenade or fire the flamethrower that would have silenced the gun. Assault teams used smoke grenades when possible, covering fire from other positions, anything to create a few seconds of concealment. Then they'd rush the bunker entrance, grenades first, then small arms fire, then clear the interior. Inside the bunker, fights were short and brutal. Close quarters, no room to maneuver, often over in seconds. Survivors on both sides describe these moments as the most intense of the entire battle. By early afternoon on June 6th, the tide had literally and figuratively turned. Pockets of American infantry and engineers had fought their way off the beach and up the bluffs. They'd knocked out or bypassed the remaining strong points. An after-action report from Omaha Beach stated that the high ground was taken solely through the plain, undaunted heroism of the infantry and their engineers after the pre-landing bombardment had failed. Once the MG42 positions were neutralized, the change was immediate. With beach exits open, armor and reinforcements could finally move inland. The German defensive line lost the firepower it depended on most, and the invasion rolled forward. The experience of being behind an MG42 on D-Day left deep psychological scars on both sides. For Allied veterans, the sound of the weapon, that distinctive baw-saw, never left them. Decades later, they'd describe hearing it in their sleep. The way it made you freeze, made you want to dig into the sand and never move. For German veterans, the memories were different, but equally haunting. Severloh, the gunner who fired 12,000 rounds at Omaha Beach, spoke little about it for decades. He went home to his farm, tried to live a normal life, but the weight never left him. Years later, he reached out to families of fallen American soldiers, tried to explain, tried to apologize in his way. He even met David Silva, an American veteran he'd wounded on the beach. The two men sat together and talked. Once enemies trying to kill each other, now just old men trying to make sense of what they'd been part of. For Severloh, it was a small measure of peace, but many other gunners never found that. Some carried guilt for the rest of their lives. Others justified it as following orders, doing their duty, and some simply refused to talk about it at all. The treatment of surrendering machine gunners varied widely. At some positions, German crews surrendered and were taken into custody without incident, disarmed, searched, sent to the rear. At others, the fighting was so intense and emotions so raw that surrender wasn't accepted. There are accounts from other beaches, Utah, Juneau, and Sword, where German crews raised white flags and were allowed to walk out, where Allied soldiers, despite casualties, followed the rules of war. But there are also accounts where prisoners were shot after surrendering, where wounded gunners were finished off rather than evacuated. These stories rarely made it into official histories. They were kept quiet, hidden, because they complicated the narrative of liberation and heroism. But veterans on both sides knew they happened. And for gunners considering surrender in those final moments, that knowledge made the decision even more terrifying. The mental strain of being an MG42 gunner was immense even before considering capture. You could hear the attackers getting closer, boots on the ground above, voices shouting, grenades exploding nearby. Knowing they were coming for you specifically, that your weapon had made you the priority target. Some gunners broke under the pressure, abandoned their positions, fled into the countryside. Others stayed until they were overrun, whether from duty, fear of their officers, or belief they had no other choice. When the end came, it wasn't always the relief they'd hoped for. Surrender meant uncertainty. Would you be treated as a prisoner of war? Or would the soldiers who just lost friends to your gun take justice into their own hands? For many, being killed outright seemed like the better option compared to that uncertainty. At least death was final. Surrender meant living with what you'd done and hoping those you'd done it to would let you live. The MG42 on D-Day was both a tactical weapon and a psychological one. Its effectiveness came not just from the rate of fire or the accuracy, but from the terror it inspired. The sound alone could break an attack. The sight of soldiers falling in waves could crush morale. But that same effectiveness made the men behind the guns into targets. Not just military targets during the battle, but targets for reprisal after. The weapon that gave them power also marked them for death, whether in combat or after surrender. For the Allies, neutralizing these positions was the key to breaking through the beach defenses. Every MG42 silenced opened a path inland. Every bunker cleared meant fewer casualties in subsequent waves. The fight to take out these guns was brutal, costly, and essential. For the Germans, the MG42 represented their best chance to stop the invasion. If they could hold the beaches long enough, inflict enough casualties, maybe the Allies would be forced to withdraw. Maybe they could buy time for reinforcements. Maybe they could turn the tide. They couldn't. By the end of June 6th, all 5 beaches were secured. Over 150,000 Allied troops were ashore. The Atlantic Wall had been breached, and the road to Berlin was open. The MG42 gunners who survived D-Day faced different fates. Some were captured and sent to POW camps, spending the rest of the war behind wire. Others escaped the beaches and fought on through Normandy, retreating with the German army as it was pushed back toward Germany. Many carried their experiences for the rest of their lives. The faces they'd seen through the firing slit, the sounds of wounded men screaming, the knowledge of how many they'd killed in those hours on June 6th. For survivors on both sides, the MG42 became a symbol of D-Day's brutality. Films like Saving Ryan Private immortalized its sound, that boss-our rip that defined the beach landings. The bunkers still stand in Normandy today, silent now, but reminders of what happened there. The question of what happened to surrendering gunners on D-Day doesn't have one simple answer. Some were treated according to the rules of war, others weren't. The fog of battle, the emotions of combat, the losses suffered, all created situations where the Geneva Convention was forgotten or ignored. Officially, Allied forces took thousands of German prisoners on D-Day. Officially, those prisoners were processed and held according to international law. But unofficially, in the chaos of the beaches, in the moments right after bunkers were overrun, the reality was more complicated, more brutal, more human. The men behind the MG42s on D-Day weren't monsters. They were soldiers, following orders, defending positions, doing what they'd been trained to do. And when they surrendered, they hoped for mercy from men they'd been trying to kill all morning. Sometimes they got it, sometimes they didn't. And that uncertainty, that knowledge that surrender might not save you, made those final moments even more terrifying than the battle itself. If you found this story compelling, you might want to check out our video on flamethrower troops on Iwo Jima. It is on the screen. Click, and I will see you there.